The heavy, double oak doors of the Metropolitan Courtroom remain closed to the chaotic world outside, sealing in an atmosphere of artificial tranquility. Inside these walls, the air feels weighted down by centuries of precedent and the sterile scent of old parchment. The judge, a man whose silver hair reflects the cold, unfeeling fluorescent lights, sits atop his mahogany throne, a living embodiment of the state's absolute authority. Every word he speaks is recorded as gospel, and every movement within the gallery is dictated by rigid protocols. Here, the law is an invisible force field, keeping raw human emotions at bay. But today, the silence is brittle, waiting for a single vibration to shatter the illusion of control that has governed this sacred room for many decades. At the defense table sits the remorseless defendant, a man whose casual posture suggests he is watching a dull documentary. Across the aisle, the grieving father sits perfectly still. His knuckles are white as he grips the edge of the wooden pew, his eyes fixed on the man who stole the bright, innocent light from his life. The judge begins to read a procedural motion, his voice a monotonous drone. In this moment of bureaucratic indifference, the remorseless defendant turns his head. He catches the father's gaze and, with a slow movement, curves his lips into a sickening smirk. It is a mocking signal that despite the handcuffs, he still holds the power to inflict pain. For the grieving father, the world suddenly goes silent. The judge's voice fades into a distant hum, and the polished wood of the courtroom begins to look like a cage. He realizes with soul-crushing clarity that the system he was once desperately told to trust is nothing more than a theater. The lawyers will argue and the judge will rule, but none of it will ever fill the howling void in his chest. The law offers closure, but it does not offer justice. As he watches that arrogant sneer, a primal realization takes hold. If the state cannot protect the sanctity of life, it has no right to demand his restraint. The boundaries of the court become nothing more than flimsy obstacles in the path of a man who has lost everything. The movement is so sudden that the bailiffs don't have time to react. In a blur of movement fueled by pure grief, the grieving father launches himself over the wooden partition. He clears the gap with the agility of a predator, his hands reaching for the throat of the man who laughed at his loss. The sound that erupts from his lungs is a guttural roar. He collides with the defendant, sending the chair spinning and legal documents flying like confetti. For a few frantic seconds, the sacred space is transformed into a scene of raw struggle, where the only law is the weight of a father's fists, a physical manifestation of his broken heart. Chaos descends like a physical weight. The judge, once a god presiding over mortals, scrambles backward as he watches the system collapse. His gavel lies forgotten. Bailiffs swarm the scene, their shouts lost in the gasps from the gallery. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. As the father is dragged from the room, a haunting silence returns. The remorseless defendant is hauled to his feet, blood dripping from his lip, yet he is still smiling. As the judge leans forward, his hands shaking as he tries to restore order, the defendant leans in close. The guards are preoccupied, and for a split second, the defendant is inches from the judge's ear. He whispers a single, chilling sentence, suggesting that the father's outburst was merely the opening act of a much more violent play. The judge pales, his face turning the color of ash, the realization dawning on him that the walls of his sanctuary are no longer thick enough to keep the encroaching darkness out. The echo of the father's roar vibrated within the wood-paneled walls, but while the rest of the room remained frozen in shock, the framed defendant sat in a different kind of silence. To him, the previous outburst was merely a preview, a crack in the glass that he was about to shatter completely. A man in his 30s, he was etched with the weariness of 1,000 sleepless nights spent rehearsing a defense that no one believed. He felt the cold iron of the handcuffs against his wrists, but more than that, he felt the suffocating weight of a system that had already decided his fate. The judge, having regained a semblance of his icy composure, adjusted his robes and looked down from his elevated perch. To the judge, this was just another docket to clear, another soul to process. But to the man at the defense table, this was the end, and the walls of the courtroom were beginning to feel like a tomb. The betrayal came not from the prosecution, but from his own side of the aisle. The defense lawyer, whose expensive suit had once inspired a flickering hope, stood up with a defeated slouch. His voice was a low murmur as he admitted to a piece of evidence that had been the cornerstone of their resistance, a digital record that was supposed to be their shield. As the lawyer conceded that the evidence was insurmountable, effectively guaranteeing a life sentence, the framed defendant felt a cold electric shock surge through his spine. The betrayal was absolute. It was the sound of a key turning in a lock that would never be opened again. He looked at the back of his lawyer's head, seeing not a protector, but a gatekeeper to a cage. The realization hit him hard. The law was a ritual of sacrifice, and he was the one destined for the altar. As the judge leaned forward to deliver the official weight of the sentence, his silver hair catching the light like a blade, the physical signs of the framed defendant's snap became undeniable. His hands began to shake with a violent tremor. His breathing became heavy and shallow, a ragged sound drowned out by the judge's clinical recitation of the law. The world around him began to blur, the faces of the jurors in the gallery fading into a hazy mass. All he could see was the judge's face, an impartial authority that had looked upon his suffering with indifference. He was no longer a man, he was a cornered animal, and the internal monologue of reason had been replaced by a singular pulsing drive to strike back. He waited, his muscles coiling like a spring, tracking the judge's movements with predatory precision. The moment arrived when the judge lowered his head to read the final decree. The framed defendant did not hesitate. He launched himself from the defense desk, clearing the mahogany barrier in a single, desperate leap. It was a physical manifestation of a man with nothing left to lose, a defiance of the very physics of the courtroom. The stenographers shrieked, their fingers freezing over their keys as the defendant's shadow fell across the bench. He collided with the judge's workspace, sending heavy law books and the ornamental gavel clattering to the floor. The judge's eyes widened in a rare, fleeting moment of genuine terror as he realized the distance between his authority and his mortality was only a few inches of polished wood. The struggle was a desperate, uncoordinated scramble. The framed defendant reached for the judge's robes, his fingers snagging on the black silk as they both tumbled toward the floor behind the bench. Bailiffs, still reeling from the first attack, rushed forward with their batons drawn, their shouts echoing through the high-vaulted ceiling. The gallery was in a state of total pandemonium, the once silent observers now a chaotic mass of fleeing bodies. In the midst of this physical collapse of order, the judge found himself pinned against the cold marble wall. The godlike status he had cultivated for decades stripped away by the raw, trembling hands of a man who felt the system had failed him. Yet, even as the guards swarmed the bench to pull the attacker away, a new shadow emerged. From the third row of the gallery, a man who had been sitting quietly stood up. He didn't look like a criminal. He looked like an ordinary citizen. Yet there was a chilling calmness in his eyes that didn't match the surrounding panic. As he reached into his jacket, the perspective shifted once again. This was not just a series of isolated breakdowns. The accomplice stood tall, his gaze fixed on the judge who was still gasping for air. The realization rippled through the room. The father's rage and the defendant's leap were not just outbursts. They were a coordinated distraction, a planned dismantling of the court's sanctity, to clear the path for something much larger and far more dangerous. The accomplice in the gallery didn't pull a weapon, but instead he raised a hand, a signal that froze the remaining air in the room. As the bailiffs finally wrestled the framed defendant off the judge, the high-authority metropolitan courtroom had been transformed from a temple of law into a jagged landscape of broken wood and shattered illusions. The judge, his black robes torn at the shoulder and his face smeared with the dust of the scuffle, didn't wait for help. He scrambled to his feet, his hands trembling not with the weakness of age, but with the adrenaline of a man who had stared into the void and pushed back. For the first time in 30 years, he wasn't looking at the law books. He was looking into the eyes of the people he judged, seeing them not as case numbers, but as a sea of volatile humanity. Security reinforcements flooded through the rear doors, their boots thumping against the marble floor in a rhythmic beat of delayed order. They pinned the accomplice and secured the perimeter, But the psychological breach was absolute. The sanctity of the court had been desecrated, not by a single act of violence, but by the systematic dismantling of its authority. Amidst this rising tide of uniforms and shouting, the notorious defendant, who had sat through the entire day with a chilling, predatory stillness, finally rose to his feet. Even with the weight of heavy chains rattling against his wrists, his presence commanded a sudden, terrifying silence. He looked at the judge, then at the gallery. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. He spoke of the thin, translucent line that separated the man behind the bench from the man in the cage. He argued that the court was merely a theater of shadows where everyone played a part until the pain became too real to be contained by a gavel. "You call this justice?" he sneered, his eyes locking onto the judge's pale face. "But it is only a cage with better lighting. When the heart breaks, no law can mend it, and when the system fails to protect the innocent, the guilty are no longer the ones in the dock. You rule over men's lives, yet you have forgotten the weight of their blood." He stood there, defiant against the backdrop of the failing institution. In the front row, the grieving father watched the scene with a hollow, haunted expression. Seeing the invincible court system crumble under the weight of human rage didn't bring him the peace he expected. Instead, he saw the fragility of the world he lived in. The judge, once a cold pillar of stone, now looked small and profoundly human as he clutched the edge of his desk for support. The trauma was etched into every face in the room: the stenographers who would never type without a flinch, the bailiffs who would forever look at the gallery with suspicion, and the judge who would never again feel safe behind his mahogany shield. The physical struggle was over, but the damage to the collective psyche was profound. The days that followed brought new security protocols: metal detectors at every turn, bulletproof glass, and a permanent armed presence. Sentences for courtroom outbursts were doubled, but the scars remained. The Metropolitan Courtroom was repaired, the wood polished back to a high shine, yet the atmosphere had permanently shifted. The air felt thinner, colder. As the judge returned to his bench weeks later, he looked at his gavel, a simple wooden tool that once carried the weight of destiny. He realized then that true justice could never be fully served in a room where the human heart is pushed past its limit. The law could dictate punishment and it could enforce order, but it could never truly heal the raw, bleeding wounds of those who felt the system had failed them, leaving only the hollow echo of